Welcome to episode 77 of Dialogika, a podcast between two friends about the latest in society, politics, and feminism in Indonesia and the world. I'm Stephanie Tangkilisan.
And I'm Suidian Lee.
And this week we are doing an In Memoriam episode on the passing of former President B.J. Habibie.
We're going to talk not only about our own personal feelings about his passing, but also his unique legacy as one of the true fathers of Indonesian democracy.
So here's to it.
By the way, listeners, if you have been following the saga of the both of us, I've just recently moved back home to Indonesia. You might hear a lot of noise, background noise from my end. It's because I'm currently recording. I'm currently recording outside in just the overall house space. My old room has been turned into a nursery, so apologies for that. But hopefully by our next episode, I'll have a real room now, and we can record peacefully.
Yeah, okay.
So listeners, in case you have not been in the news, especially if you're not here in Indonesia, former President B.J. Habibie passed away on September 11th, 2019 at the age of 83.
He's been pretty ill for quite some time and receiving medical treatment and being in and out of a hospital, but still, nonetheless, I think we just saw when he did pass just an outpouring of national sadness, I would say.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was also really sad because I think I had the good fortune of knowing him. Like, I've had dinner with him a couple of times when I was introduced to him by his granddaughter, who's a good friend of mine. And yeah, like, what you see is truly what you get. It's not like a front or, you know, posturing of any kind of way. He truly is just the most wonderful, loving man who, if you met him and you're kind of a younger person, he would be like, oh, call me Ayang, you know, like, call me grandfather. And that's just his personality. And he was always happy to mentor you and give you advice and just be kind of the grandfather that most people never have.
Yeah.
And I think our country was just very lucky to have a president like him overseeing our democracy. And I think that's why we want to talk more about his legacy and what he did for our country, because especially in the last few years, his popularity resurfaced because of his love story with Ainun, his wife who passed. And although that is a really sweet story and wonderful story, we want to talk a little bit about kind of his political legacy that we don't often get to talk about as much, and how consequential he is to our democracy, which I think is kind of the most fitting way I can think of to remember him. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, with his love story, it's so wonderful. And, like, whenever I did have dinner with him, and he did talk about Ainun a lot also. And
yeah,
I don't know if you, for some context, if you don't know the story, is he married his wife Ainun, a very educated doctor, and throughout their life, and he was always just extremely progressive and, you know, allowed and had an equal marriage with her and, like, loved her. And his book came out because he was, as he said it, extremely depressed after she passed away, and just, like, kind of catatonic in a way after she passed. So the doctor told him either he was going to pass away following her, or he needed to write something down of his feelings for her and just process it. Otherwise, yeah, he would go down with the grief. So
you want to recover, right?
Yeah, so that's what he did, and they made a movie out of it. They made 2 movies out of it, I think. And
yeah, they made 2 movies.
Yeah, so that's how the nation fell back in love with him. But he was just way more than that as well.
Saya pergi ke Taman Pahlawan. Saya nyekar melati. Dan saya doakan untuk Ibu Ainun. Dan selalu uniform yang sama. Selendangnya pengabdian Ibu Ainun saya pakai. Di bawah bantal saya selendangnya ibu Ainun. Sebelum saya tidur, saya doakan untuk Ibu Ainun.
So I don't know if this was a part of the book, but, as a feminist podcast, I would like to mention, I was just digging through my old photos and videos to send my friend some of the videos of him and her that I have in my camera roll and I found this video of him just he was an engineer at the time and she was a doctor, and she was they started having kids, and it was either you become the captain of the ship or I become the captain of the show, the family. But either way, something has got to give. And I'm giving you the choice to pick. Do you want to be captain or do you want me to be the captain?
That's amazing.
And she ultimately chose for him to be the captain. But he was up to you. Either way works for me. I think that's just super cool. And, when I asked, and when a lot of us asked him, okay, so... as women, we're told to compromise and, not be too smart or, not to be too threatening. And he would always be no, no, you need to find someone who would appreciate your intelligence and ambition.
Yes.
And just not to settle. And, it's okay to wait for the right person. And, he's always just wait for someone who would respect that.
Yeah.
And I think that's just such an atypical response from an older Indonesian man for you to be patient and not try to settle down and have kids. And he was just find a guy like me, it's, we're out there. And everyone just all the girls just look at each other and we're just you're not a common person. We really appreciate the sentiment.
That's part of his charm, right?
Yeah, and it's completely not an act. He is just completely so authentically himself and so unhypercritical. There's no part of him where it's pencitraan or trying to appear to be something that he's not. This is just who he is, and he applies those principles and his integrity to both his personal life and political life, which is...
I think this is also why, when he passed last week, there was such a outpouring of love, not only from the people but also from politicians that he's clashed with in the past, right? Akbar Tanjung, people from various factions who can, even if they have disagreed with him in the past, they can totally respect his sincerity and his commitment to Indonesia. And I think that's such a rare thing to say about any politician anywhere, but certainly in Indonesia. We are so lucky to have had him lead the country, even if it was just for a short amount of time, but it was such a crucial amount of time. What would the transition been like if he wasn't the one in charge right after Suharto stepped down?
The fact that he is so authentic was also, I think, a part of why he's not necessarily a typical politician, because what is often said is he's not a politician.
Yeah.
Because the reason why Suharto picked him in the first place is that he's a clearly very intelligent guy, an engineer who lived in Germany for a really long time. He's a scientist and extremely well credentialed. Suharto saw him as okay, he's not gonna grab political power and oust me while still looking good on paper and for international audiences.
Yeah.
But when Suharto was finally ousted, it is notable that Habibie resisted Prabowo Subianto's calls to give him the power and really showed that he had the mettle of a leader, because it could have gone really the opposite way.
It was a power vacuum, right?
Yeah, there was a really tense period of time where the military tried to take over post the coup, and Habibie was just nope, this is going to transition to a democracy.
Yeah. Certainly over the last few years, the kind of, maybe other than Jokowi, the kind of leaders that have ascended to the presidency have sort of worked their way up and, ingrained themselves into the political order, while Habibie, I've always felt he's a technocrat, right? He's not really a politician. His strength and his experience is in these technical details and sort of the precision of things, and to just suddenly be able to show that kind of mettle as a politician and as a leader against an intense situation is just, I don't know if other people could have done that. The bravery and the courage to have to stand up against the military at a very tense time where who's to say that the country wasn't going to go into chaos?
Yeah.
Stephanie, how short was Habibie's reign as the president, as the third president of Indonesia?
18 months. You can carry 2 babies at that period of time. But that 18 months was, I guess, incredibly pivotal.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from like making sure that it wasn't seized by military control, he did like some really revolutionary stuff in his first few months of office, including releasing political prisoners, he actually had the joint fact-finding team for the May 98 crisis, at least get that memory for posterity, and get those facts in posterity, and to this day, it's kind of like the foundational record for the atrocities that happened in May 98, and like how we know the violence was clearly orchestrated, and interviewed so many victims of the rape and the chaos that happened post 98. He also created the decree that founded the National Commission on Violence Against Women, which is a Indonesian watchdog that to this day focuses on accounting the amount of sexual violence that occurs in the country and assist women who want to go through the judicial system and like make sure that each branches of government actually do take steps to improve how they handle sexual assault and violence.
Yeah, Komnas
And
Perempuan.
it's like one of the most functional watchdog bodies, and I actually volunteered there. And President Habibie was consistently, to the end, like involved with fundraising, like just behind the scenes. Like every time they needed someone to like guest star or something to like bring an audience, he would just be like, "Okay, I'm coming." Like, so
He always
just
made
like
the time for them.
Yeah. But aside from that, I think one of the more pivotal things as well is he held the referendum for East Timor, which allowed East Timor a real act of free choice to decide if they wanted to continue to be part of Indonesia or not. So in that year, in 1999, he acknowledged that the Indonesian military committed various acts of atrocities and held a real free and fair commission. And in a way, this is also what kind of sealed his fate in terms of like...
I mean, a lot of people didn't want that referendum to happen.
Yeah.
A lot of politicians were like, why are you conceding to them? Why are you giving away the territory?
Yeah.
The military didn't want that to happen either. They were threatening him over this decision.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, it probably sealed his fate.
After that, he had to concede that President Abdurrahman Wahid was gonna take over his role. At first, he wanted to stay on because he felt like the work wasn't done,
But
but
Golkar,
he wanted a peaceful democratic process to follow through, so he backed down. But like, I think you can see from what he did with East Timor that he's very firm with his decision, and
Yeah.
I think stubborn in the best possible sense of the word. Like
yeah.
he is a scientist, and he is a principled man, and he's charismatic and funny and sweet, but he also sticks for his principles. And it's like its actions speak louder than words kind of person.
Yeah, he stands up for what he believes in.
Yeah, and I talked to him about East Timor. I remember now, and he was like still, I think this was like 2 years ago, and he was like still super very adamant and passionate that what he did was the right thing, and he had no regrets. And like he said that people might disagree with him, but that was the right call.
That's what's groundbreaking about him, right?
He's such an anomalous Indonesian politician, right? Like, he is just...
It's almost like, how did he become a politician?
Yeah.
He was so willing to stand up for decisions that was going to be unpopular, that was probably going to cost him, and it did cost him his political leadership. But he was principled enough and stood by his values enough to say, this is the thing we have to do no matter what. Like, the fact that he called free elections after he became president was a big deal, right? Because I could imagine a slew of politicians would just hold on to power. But he was like, no, we need to have elections. We need to let the people decide.
Mm-hmm.
It was amazing. Also kind of sad, right? Because you do wonder a little bit if he had stayed on as president, like how many more of these reforms and changes and modernization could have happened, because he did a lot in 18 months. Like, can you imagine? Most presidents don't do that much in 18 months.
No. I like almost, Sweden saw this, but I wrote kind of like a memorial post, and I just like nixed it because I felt weird about posting something like that. But I guess what I wanted to say was that he is kind of like the president we didn't deserve, and I think he's the kind of president that, you know, if our subsequent presidents, you know, followed more of, like, we would have a very different country, and we would be so much better for it, you know? Like, he is, like, way ahead of his time, in a way.
And continues to be way ahead of his time.
Continues ahead of his time. Like, I think if he was president today, like, I still think a lot of Indonesians would struggle with how progressive he is.
Yeah. Just begs the question then. Do you think it's better for him that he, you know, because he did so much after his presidency in terms of being sort of like the guiding light and the wise grandfather to a lot of politicians, a lot of young people, activists, etc. Do you think it's more useful, I guess, for Indonesia, the fact that he still had this influence, but he was out of the seat of power, so he didn't have the baggage of being president?
Yeah.
Because sometimes I do feel a little bit like with him being out of power, he didn't have the pressure of being president, and he's sort of like, he might not be able to directly influence things, but he can like guide the conversation through like his think tank, through his appearances and his influence and his advice with various presidents, various politicians.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's the neutral base for politicians. Like anybody of both sides of the aisle can appeal to him and be like, so what do you think we should do?
Help me, please. Yeah, and it just like goes to show, like, I guess the lack of ego he has, you know, and like,
and the respect everyone
had for him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
he made himself available not only to politicians, right, but so much to the people as well. And I think, again, this is part of the outpouring of grief and love after his passing, is that everybody felt so close to him, even though that's not true in real life, right? Like, but it's almost like everybody felt that he was their grandfather. He was their Eyang. I mean, there was a weird moment after he passed where people were taking selfies at his grave, and that's just not okay.
Please don't do that. Please don't do that.
Please, listeners. That's just not cool at all.
That's just really weird.
And in my opinion, disrespectful.
I don't know.
I get what you're trying to do.
I don't understand why that's a thing, honestly. I'm sorry. Like, why? But
anyway, yeah, don't do that. But also, celebrate his legacy by truly celebrating the things he fought for, right?
Yeah.
Instead of taking all these photos and selfies to commemorate him, like commemorate him by reminding everyone of his legacy, of his work, of the values that he strove for.
Right.
I think it's fascinating that Habibie, who was appointed as vice president by Suharto, as somebody who in Suharto's eyes wasn't going to be a threat to him, it's almost like the antithesis of Suharto, because he advocated for like free press. He advocated for true political democracy and having more than 3 mandated political parties, really being inclusive and welcoming to the variety of ethnicities and ethnic groups of Indonesia, right? Like, one of his key principles is like a democracy that thrives in diversity.
Yeah.
And especially in the last few years, that's been such a hot button issue, like racial tensions, identity, diversity, etc. Like, Habibie advocated and strove for that 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're still talking about the same issues about race. And it's kind of heartbreaking that we won't have somebody like him to sort of like guide us through this, because he lived through the country's worst period in terms of racial tensions, and he is always trying to to correct the ship, right? He's always trying to guide people towards really welcoming people, really celebrating the diversity of Indonesia, because it's such a unique part of Indonesian identity. And I really do hope that like future leaders, future politicians, future young people like us really remember that that's one of his key legacies, at least in my view, is that he did not just want a democracy for democracy's sake. He wanted a true, robust, and strong, authentic democracy, and that takes work. And he was willing to do the work.
Yeah, he was willing to take the political cost and, you know, the personal cost it would take, and especially amidst the virulent NKRI kind of patriotism, he knew that his love of country meant that he was willing to make the difficult decisions to take those decisive moments and make the right decisions, and showing up for those decisions regardless of how it would seem at the time. Or I think that's the kind of bravery and true love of country that most politicians should aspire to and maybe don't have. And I think we as a country were extremely lucky to have him at that particular moment of time in it, you know, and I don't know when we're going to have a politician like that again.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe we ought to have less politicians and more scientists in a position of power. It's always like those who don't desire power may be the best ones who wield it. It's this whole idea of, you know, the philosopher king, and from Socrates through Plato, who talked about the philosopher king, or like the scientist who, I mean, at the time of ancient Greek, blah, 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 the philosopher is also a scientist. They're all like kind of studied people who love wisdom and knowledge. It's like different from like the conception of philosophers and scientists today, but it's very specialized and distinct. But like the idea there is the person who desires power shouldn't be a politician and shouldn't rule. It's actually the person who has the most wisdom and knows better should be the one ruling, because they know better. And I think it's no one exemplifies that in our Indonesian presidents than Habibie did.
Yeah.
Because if you desire power, you know, it's kind of like you are going to rule for the sake of power, and you're going to rule on how to maintain it. And it's not, and the best ruler should just actually focus on, you know, morally doing what is morally right, and to do what is good and to do what is just, as opposed to doing things for the preservation of power and being burdened by how to accumulate that power.
And I think that's incredibly important, not just for Indonesian democracy, but also for democracies everywhere in the world right now. I think Habibie's example as a president can be looked on as an incredible example for anybody. Like, you know, even well-established democracies like the U.S., like people are clinging on to power instead of making the right decisions. And we are truly blessed to have somebody like him preside over the country over incredibly tumultuous times. And I keep looking back thinking, like, he didn't have to come back, you know. He had a incredible, fulfilling life in Germany in terms of, like, he was really rising up the ranks in the private space, in the aerospace industry. He was an incredibly gifted and intelligent engineer, like one of the smartest engineers, writing a lot of like different kinds of theories and scientific treatises. Like, he was incredible. But you know, when Suharto called him to come back, he did. He answered the call of the nation.
Yeah. And
that's just incredible, you know, to think that somebody would give it all up to come back.
And I think it's, sorry to go back to like ancient Greek philosophy again.
This is just Stephanie, guys.
But
par for the course.
Welcome to being friends with me. But, you know, like there's this idea of the good man cannot be harmed in life or in death. And you know, this idea that even though he was surrounded by Suharto's ill decisions and like that whole dictatorship, that he continued to do the right thing in whatever capacity he could.
Yeah.
And like he's just very wise, you know, like it's not like he's like, oh, I'm not gonna work with him, like I'm not gonna do whatever. Like, he took his time to, like, make sure that he made the right calls to do the right things for his country. And I think, like, a lot of young people today, myself included, we're, like, so impetuous and, like, unwilling to compromise sometimes. And it's, like, maybe there are moments where we need to, like, think about the right thing to do given the circumstances are, you know? And not that you need to compromise, but you need to figure out how you can best affect change in your situation.
I think it's telling that during his presidency, you know, during his 18 months in power, he created the Habibie Center, which is his independent think tank. I'm thinking about this, right? Like, almost as if, like, he wanted to establish something that can outlive his presidency, and it certainly did. I mean, he probably did not anticipate his presidency to be so short. But, you know, he's established something that can continue working to advocate for the things he advocated while he was in power, when he was out of power, and now when he's no longer here. You know, I think so many people who have gone through that think tank and so many of the great minds that have contributed to the work there continues to uphold the values and the principles that Habibie upheld. And it's a sad time for our country, but I'm also, you know, optimistically hopeful.
Reminded of how lucky that we had him in the first place, and how I'm sure that there are people like him in our country, and we need to find those people and support them in whatever way we can.
Exactly. Like, Habibie set down the foundations for true democracy within the government, but also within society, and it is now our job as the next generation to keep it growing, to keep it flourishing. I think that's the best way to really commemorate his life and work.
Itu saya sarankan Anda harus menjadi andalan dari keluargamu dan bangsamu. Caranya, jangan lepaskan budayamu. Budaya itu dapat dari orang tua, dari masyarakat lingkungannya, dan dari agamanya. Sinergi budaya dan agama menghasilkan iman dan takwa yang saya bilang intak. Jadi budaya itu harus Anda kembangkan terus kualitasnya. Oke? Jadi cita-cita saya adalah sampai hari detik ini, insya Allah saya mengalami bahwa sumber daya manusia terbarukan di bumi Indonesia itu kualitas kehidupannya dan keterampilannya meningkat terus.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find more information and resources of whatever we talked about on our website, dialogika.id.
Music credits to John Dealey, Lee Roosevelt, and of course, Broke for Free.
If you like what you hear and want to support us, please review our podcast on the Apple Podcast app or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast. And please share our podcast with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about Dialogika.
If you want to get more involved, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is dialogikapodcast@gmail.com, or just shoot us a message on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, and now Twitter. Please follow us on these various platforms. Our Twitter handle is @dialogikapod. Also, follow me on Twitter. It's Steftangk. That's STEPHTANGK.
Thank you again, and see you guys next time.
Bye!